Hi, class. So today we're going to be looking at basically sectional crises that have occurred leading up to the Civil War. So you can follow along in this PowerPoint and remember that there is a note section in the PowerPoint if you want any more information on these ideas. For this particular PowerPoint, the notes come straight from the textbook, so you can also follow along in your book. But I think it's important to understand this material because a lot of it is going to be very important for your next paper. So your next paper is going to be looking at the spread of people west and the impact that the opening of the West has on the American people and how that helps to lead to the Civil War. We're thinking about things like the expansion of slavery and questions over slavery. There are people in the North who worry that the expansion of slavery is going to change the way Americans live and it's going to upset the balance that they have in Senate and in the Congress. You also, of course, have people in the South who see the West as a way to expand in a way the empires that they have created, thinking about the spread of cotton further west, thinking about just the spread of slavery in general and what that could potentially mean. So we're going to start off by looking at the Oregon Trail and thinking about this. As far as the Oregon Trail, in the 1830s, there were few families who had really ventured towards the West, but in the 1840s, that really starts to change. The Panic of 1837 prompted a lot of Americans to start looking for different opportunities, and they believed the West might have that. What I have up here is sort of a picture of the Oregon Trail, and if you did the extra credit activity, then you played the Oregon Trail game. And while it is just a game, it is somewhat fitting for what the Oregon Trail might have actually been like. If you played the game, you saw that there's not really a good chance that you're going to make it fully intact. So if you had a party of, say, 6 people, there's a good chance that only a few of them are actually going to make it to the West. A lot of people, their goal is to make it as far as they can, but for some, going west doesn't mean traveling quite as far as you might have wanted to. The Oregon Trail began in St. Louis, and from there, people traveled in their wagons across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains towards the Pacific coast. By 1860, some 350,000 Americans had made the journey, and he claimed a lot of land. You had to bring a lot of supplies with you. It would be best if you could bring as many healthy people with you as you could to help you on your journey. There are instances where entire families, not just your little nuclear family with a mom, dad, and the kids, but thinking about parents and their kids and nieces, nephews, aunts, uncles, cousins, entire families are making this journey. And there's a couple reasons for that. Again, it's going to be helpful on the journey. The more supplies you have, the more wagons you have, the better off you are. But on top of that, a lot of people understand that with the West, it could potentially be very lonely. And if you take American history too, that class sort of really focuses in on the West for a couple of weeks and looking at what people go through once they get there. You're thinking about going into these Great Plains regions, going towards the Pacific coast. We think about areas out there now and how populated they are, but they haven't been that way for a long period of time compared to other big hotspots in the United States. And if you go out there, you're definitely going to want to have people that you can interact with and that you can talk with. In addition to that, most people have to sell their homes and as many of their possessions as they can in order to get these wagons. Sometimes they break down. There's also the question of when you should start your journey. And if you did play the game, and if you didn't, I encourage you to go back and look at it. But if you start your journey too early, then you could potentially run out of supplies. If you start too late, then you're thinking about going in when it's going to be winter. And there are a lot of issues with that. I encourage you to look up, you can look up different YouTube videos and things on the Donner Party. And basically what happens to this party is it's a bunch of people who end up heading west. I mean, we're thinking about a lot of people from a particular area. They head west and they end up having a lot of issues along the way. There are instances instances where they get caught by winter weather, by these storms. They tried to take a shortcut. It definitely didn't pan out well from them. Very few people actually end up surviving. There are instances where they send out a rescue party trying to get help, trying to find someone who can come and rescue them, to get them where they need to go, or to at least get them more supplies. And when they go out, I mean, these people are again caught in a storm. Very bad situations, leads in some instances to cannibalism. Really not something that you would do if you were really well off to begin with. So yeah, definitely look into that if that's something that you are interested in. In addition to all of that, there were a lot of accidents, issues with people drowning because they're having to cross rivers and lakes. You also have issues with measles, mumps, scarlet fever, other deadly diseases that they definitely didn't have vaccines or cures for. 20% of women on the trail would become pregnant, and that's going to lead to even greater danger as far as giving birth to those children or having the supplies needed to give birth to those children. And there's a lot of issues that end up occurring. Now, one reason why a lot of people might have gone west, especially single young men, would be because of the gold rush. So, despite the hazards, a lot of Americans traveled using the Oregon Trail or the Santa Fe Trail because of this gold rush. They want to get to California. Um, Once they get there, some of these agents or single men who go out to look for gold actually end up marrying into elite Mexican ranch families. These are known as Californinos. These are people who were living in California before people started heading west. And in this area, you do have somewhat of a mix between people of Mexican and American heritage, but a lot of these families are very, very, very wealthy and have been for a long time as far as their ranches and what they're doing out there. But the gold rush, you have what are known as the 49ers. They race to claim the riches in California. Again, a lot of single men, brothers, neighbors, friends pack up together. Some married men leave their wives and children behind, promising to come back once they strike gold. But just to give you some numbers, you have around 80,000 men who arrive in California in 1849 alone. This is going to lead to a lot of tensions between the newly arrived whites and local Indians and Californinos. You have to think, these people had been living in the West for some of these Native American groups, you're thinking centuries. And all of a sudden, there's an influx of people coming into their land, and they're really devastating the land when they come. They might set up sort of like towns, I guess you could call it that, but they're not setting up shop for very long. They're looking for gold. They're going to extract as much gold from that area as they can. And once they're done, they're going to pack it up and they're going to either head back west if it's a married man trying to get back to his family, or they're going to move to the next mining site. Once you've extracted all of the wealth, what's the reason for staying? It's kind of how a lot of them end up seeing it. The towns they end up creating are very sort of haphazardly put together. For example, you might see a saloon that's going to be put in, so a place where men can go to drink, to gamble, to find women, things like that. And you're also going to see, of course, like hotels that pop up so men have somewhere to stay. But a lot of the stores, things like a general store or a hardware store, when they first create these, they're actually not that well constructed. Some of them are nothing more than tents where people who see the money being made on the gold rush see another opportunity of selling supplies, and they'll pack up a bunch of hardware, boots, different types of picks that you might need for mining for gold, shoes, whatever it is, and they're going to head to the west and they're going to set up these shops. Sometimes they're just tents where they set up and they sell everything they have, make their money off of the people who have been mining the gold, and then they head back home too. That's why you have a lot of ghost towns that end up basically popping up in these areas. There's also conflicts over gender roles that are going to pop up in these mining towns because of the gold rush. Because thousands of males, they need food, shelter, they need their laundry taken care of, and medical care. And some women in the region actually end up earning a very good living by renting rooms, cooking meals, doing laundry, even working as prostitutes. But because of this, there are still a lot of men who end up having to do things that they typically would not have seen as men's work. You have a lot of men who learn how to cook, a lot of men who have to take care of their own laundry. Women are very, very valuable in the West. Again, if you take American history too, you'll learn a little bit more about this, but you also have Chinese women who are imported specifically to the West in order to provide more services, whether it be through prostitution, whether it be through cooking or laundry services. But a lot of the women who are coming from places in Asia, especially China, they don't always come by force. Sometimes their families end up selling them into what we would think of as slavery, and they're going to be forced to come to California to provide these services. If you're stuck at home and you want something interesting to watch, there's a show on HBO called Deadwood, and they actually do a very good job of depicting what the West was like. I know this occurs a little bit after where our class would stop. This is a post-Civil War show, but they actually do have a lot of very interesting things that happen, and it's based roughly off of a true story of a town called Deadwood. And it's interesting to see how the prostitutes are treated, how they're viewed, the way the towns are set up, how, again, haphazardly they're sort of put together. So definitely, if you want something to check out, feel free to check that out. But yeah, so people heading to the West, whether it be with their families to open farms or plantations or ranches, and again, a lot of single men coming as well. And of course, there are a lot of issues between the incoming whites and Native Americans. There are some attacks on wagon trains, so these wagons that are going on these overland trails. And a lot of times you're actually going to see U.S. Army troops that are going to join in pushing the Native Americans back from the newly claimed land that these whites are taking up. But in parts of the West, you do see them coming together, working together. But again, that's rare. I mean, these people are coming in and they're literally taking land that people have been using for years. These settlers are real enthusiastic about their new homes. But the arrival of more whites proves disastrous for local Indians. A lot of the pioneers bring with them a lot of deadly diseases like measles that are going to end up killing more Native Americans, somewhat similar to what we saw with the Columbian Exchange earlier. But a lot of people use the Indian attacks by one Indian tribe to sort of justify violence on other Native Americans. So, for example, John Fremont and Kit Carson, their party was attacked by a group of Modoc Indians in Oregon in 1846. Once they end up settling, they actually take their revenge by destroying a Klamath Indian village, killing men, women, and children there. Again, this is a completely separate group of people, a totally different tribe of Native Americans that did not attack them, and they're taking their revenge out on them. And this gives them more land, it gives them more resources, and I mean, you have to think about what that means. In addition to moving west and disrupting the lives of these Californios and these native tribes, you also see that the expansion west is going to intensify debates over slavery and the limits of its expansion into the West. Each territory has a certain set of guidelines that they have to reach in order to apply for statehood, to come into the United States. And in a lot of cases, a crisis is going to emerge as they do that. And the government, as you guys have seen in the past, they really are trying to placate this issue and to just sweep it under the rug. They don't want to deal with slavery. Think about what we've seen so far. And again, this is going to be very important for your paper. But think about the Compromise of 1820. What did that have in it? Think about that compromise. So to give you a refresher, here is the Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1820, and let's think about how the United States, because of this expansion west, is really having to deal with the issue of slavery. So the first thing we're thinking about with the Missouri Compromise is the question of Missouri. So you have these states that are in this red color. These are free states. So if you think about where Missouri is, not only is it going to be bordering a free state, but it's also bordering and very close to states that are further south that are slave states. So that brings up the question of Missouri. Should this be a free state, or better yet, should it be a slave state? Nobody knows. These people in the South really want this to be a slave state. The people in the North really want it to be a free state. So they end up coming up with the Missouri Compromise, where they say that Missouri can in fact be a slave state. However, they're also going to add Maine up here as a free state, and that's going to help keep the sectional balance that they have in Congress and with the Senate. You're going to have the same number of free states that you have slave states. Okay, seems like a compromise. In addition to that, you're going to get the 3630 parallel, which is going to be known as the Missouri Compromise line. Now, with the line that you see here, anything that's below this line is going to be eventually open to slavery. Anything above that line will not be open to slavery. And as I asked you in last week's assessment, think about this. How could this potentially cause issues? If you think about people moving west, and we think about sort of the trajectory that we have here, as people move west from these southern states, it seems that they want to bring slavery with them. People aren't going to be moving from, say, Georgia and South Carolina up into this or an organized territory. They're going to be moving a little bit more straight than that. And if you think about places up here, they're going to also be moving more straight like that. So there's a lot of people who say, well, that could solve the issue for a little while, but what about these areas right in here? Will they eventually want to become slave states like Missouri, like Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky? Or are they going to want to be free states? And that could definitely end up being an issue, which is exactly what happened. So then you get the Compromise of 1850. So this is 30 years later, and again, they're having to answer this question. So the Compromise of 1850 is going to overturn the Missouri Compromise. It's going to leave the issue of slavery overall unsettled. So let's just take a second to unpack what this map has to say. So here's the 3630 parallel, and there's Missouri. So again, the Missouri Compromise says anything below this line, open to slavery. Anything above this line will not be open to slavery. But now the United States has this New Mexico territory, the Utah territory, Oregon, and California. How are they going to respond to this? Will they become slave states or will they become free states? According to this line, only a small sliver of the New Mexico territory can be open to slavery. But if you look up here, there's plenty of new territories that could be carved out that would not be open to slavery. So what they end up deciding, and what's going to overturn this line right here, is going to be the idea of popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty will exist in these purple areas, so the Utah territory as well as in the New Mexico territory. And what popular sovereignty means is that as areas are carved out and created as states, as they want to apply for statehood, that state or soon-to-be state is going to be able to decide for itself whether or not it will allow slavery or whether it will be free. Now, the reasoning behind this is that they believe that as people move west, they will either bring slaves with them or they won't bring slaves with them. And each territory should be able to sort of figure out for itself if slavery is something they need or something they can do without. So, as far as the Compromise of 1850, the first thing it does is, as I just showed you on the map, is that it is going to open up those territories in the West to popular sovereignty, meaning that they can decide whether or not they want to have slavery in those areas or not. The next thing that it's going to do is that it is going to abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C. What that means is that you can no longer have the sale of slaves or slave auctions in Washington, D.C. So as slavery moves further west, there are a lot of slave states that have slaves, but they're not using them as much. And slaves become very valuable. Remember, by this point, the external slave trade or the Atlantic slave trade has been cut off, which means that people are no longer going to be able to purchase slaves like that. So they have to get them from somewhere. So a lot of these more northern states in the South, places like Virginia, places like Washington, D.C., Maryland, even as far south as Tennessee and North Carolina, they don't need as many slaves. So what they're doing is they're taking their slaves and they're turning them into a profit. At this point, slaves are worth a lot of money. There are instances where you can see sort of the calculation and you can see how in today's time, slaves would have cost as much as a high-end car. Think about how expensive that, like a high-end luxury car is. And then think about the fact that if you have a slave, you can sell them for that amount of money. And people are doing that. And of course, that devastates slave families. You have a lot of families that are torn apart surely for this new profit. But Washington, D.C. is one of these huge hot spots. And because of that, in Washington, D.C., they have a really big slave trade. So that's going to be cut off in the Compromise of 1850. And the hope is that eventually this internal slave trade will stop. If they can stop it in Washington, D.C., maybe eventually places like Richmond, places like Charleston, eventually they will stop as well. In addition to that, part 3 of this compromise says that there will be a stricter fugitive slave law. Now, there was a fugitive slave law that was passed in 1793, and basically what it says is that if a slave is able to escape to the North, that it is the obligation of law enforcement in the North, as well as basically citizens, to make sure those slaves get back to their slave owners. You have to think about it. These people see slaves as nothing more than property. They dehumanize them, and they see them as nothing more than property. And they say, well, if I was to have an animal that got loose and they were able to make it to a free state, I would still get that back. So why can't I get my slave back? Extremely messed up way of viewing other human beings, but that's how a lot of people in the South see it. But a lot of people in the North, while they do still have a lot of racist tendencies, they're not actively going out and searching for these fugitive slaves. If an African American man comes into a shop or goes to a port city and wants to find work as a sailor and he says, hey, I'm free, they're not really going to question it. They're not going to be worried about getting these slaves back. But the Compromise of 1850 says that they have to send the slaves back to the South. And for a lot of people in the North, they see this as an infringement on their rights. They see it as the government forcing them to do police work, basically, forcing them to send these slaves back to the South. A lot of slave owners also end up hiring slave catchers who are going to be following these fugitive slaves, and that's going to increase as well. But you also see the number of abolitionists also increasing. More and more people, as they are forced to deal with the issue of slavery in the North, they are going to sort of make their mind up that they disagree with it. And you see more abolitionists who are willing to help people. So keep that in mind with the Compromise of 1850. You have the territories open to popular sovereignty. You have the Fugitive Slave Act, and you have the abolition of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. So thinking a little bit more about what's happening As far as the Fugitive Slave Act that goes with the Compromise of 1850, there are again more people who are trying to free more slaves. The picture I have up here for you right now, this is Harriet Tubman. And hopefully you guys have all heard of Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad before, but this is very important and it grows in the 1850s. You see more and more abolitionists as well as former slaves who are trying to get as many slaves free as they possibly can. So Harriet Tubman, she's going to end up going back to the South even after she has her own freedom in order to get more and more people out of the South. And she is very instrumental in doing this. Another issue that you see arise in the North is that basically there are commissions that are set up that say that if a slave is sent back, then you get $10 for that slave. And now that sounds like nothing to us. Like we think about $10 and you can go maybe get something to eat at a fast food place for $10. But in 1850, $10 is a lot of money. If you use a conversion calculator for inflation, $10 in 1850 would have been between about like $310 and $320 in today's money. So for a lot of people, if they can send as many slaves back as they can make a lot of money doing that. The only issue is that a lot of free blacks who live in the North and have never been enslaved will be captured and they'll be taken. They have no access to the courts, especially once they're sent further south. And these free blacks, once they're sent further south, even if it's not the right slave, two things could happen. Number one, you have a lot of these massive plantation owners who have no idea what their slaves look like. They just know on paper, I have X amount of slaves. Here's where they work. This is what they do. This is how much money they bring me in. So you bring a young black man who somewhat fits the description of what you said you were missing. They're not looking. They're just going to say, all right, well, that's him. And this person can claim that they are from the North. They can claim they are free. Sometimes they'll even have papers that prove they're free. They'll have their former employers vouch for them that, hey, this man is free, and it doesn't matter. They're still going to be basically taken back into slavery or taken into slavery. And the other issue you have is with some smaller plantation owners or people who own maybe 5 to 10 slaves, they might realize, that's definitely not the slave I'm looking for, but they're not going to fight to try and get that person back to the North to give them their freedom back. They see this as a free labor source, and they're still going to exploit it and use these slaves. So there are a lot of issues that are going to emerge over this fugitive slave law and the issue of slavery. So I'm just very briefly going to go over Franklin Pierce. There's a lot more in the notes that I encourage you to look at. But there's a lot of issues with the political parties trying to find a candidate that they feel supports them. You have groups like the Free Soilers, and they really want to find a candidate who is going to do exactly what the party name says, basically guarantee freedom in these new territories, so free soil. You also see that there are the Whigs at this point, but eventually Franklin Pierce is going to rise to the presidency, and he's really instrumental for getting the U.S. involved in more international trade. In 1846, setting up more trade with Japan, so this free trade with Asian markets, and also sort of extending trade in China, but not only is trade going to be extended, but if you take like a world history class, you'll see more of this. In China right now, they're really in a lot of trouble with the British. The British causing a lot of issues like the Opium Wars, and the U.S. really doesn't help with this. They call it like civilizing as far as expanding trade and having more of an influence in these Asian powers. But again, I'll let you guys look over that because for time's sake, we're going to move ahead to some other stuff that might be important for you with your next paper. So the next thing to talk about is going to be abolition. And we've already looked at abolition before, but you also have things that are going to happen in the 1840s and 50s. So in 1852, you're going to see the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which you might have read when you were in middle school or high school, by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Um, so basically, with Stowe, her father, Lyman Beecher, and her brother Henry are some of the nation's leading evangelicals. And what's going to end up happening is that her book is built on accounts by former slaves as well as tales gathered by abolitionists. And it really exposes how nasty and bad slavery can be. You also have the autobiographies of Frederick Douglass, Henry Bibb, lots of slave narratives that are going to be coming out. And in these slave narratives, you are going to have people in the North confronting slavery on a more personal basis. They're going to be reading stories from people who experienced it. Now, this week, you guys have the opportunity to read either Frederick Douglass or Harriet Jacobs' narrative. And I encourage you, even after you read that, to research a little bit more on who they were and what their story is. How do they become free? Why are they writing this? And it's important to think about people in the North reading these narratives for the first time, reading about people being beaten, reading about people being separated from their families because of this internal slave trade. And a lot of people who had been very apathetic and hadn't really worried about slavery in the past, now they're starting to think about it. So you're going to see the rise in abolition because of this. But Uncle Tom's Cabin itself, it was read by millions in the United States as well as England. It was also translated into French and German, and it reached a mass audience. Not just abolitionists, but again, other people. Some African Americans were sort of frustrated by the demeaning portraits of Northern free blacks. But a lot of times they realize what they have to do in order to get abolition is to appeal to Northern whites to try and get these concessions and to push for a change politically that they might not be able to get because they probably aren't able to vote and they're not able to run and obtain office. So now let's talk a little bit about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So this is going to be in 1854. So if you're keeping track of this in your mind, think about the Compromise of 1820 or the Missouri Compromise. Then we saw the Compromise of 1850, and now we're talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act was sort of set forward by Stephen Douglas, who is a senator from Illinois, and he's really pushing for expansion westward. Now, the reason why he's doing this is because, you can see Illinois right here. He wants it to gain more prominence because he feels that it is going to be this sort of gateway between the East and the West. And he wants to make sure that these states are being set up, and he hopes that the railroads that are being set up, that he can influence them to go through Illinois, again, bringing more infrastructure and money into Illinois itself. With this, you see that a lot of these Northern Democrats, as well as Southern Democrats, groups that were against slavery, who didn't want to see it expand, you're going to see them sort of start to form what will become the Republican Party. Please don't get this conflated with the Republican Party that we have today. It's really important with American history to sort of follow the trajectory of the various political parties and to see how they are transformed at different times. And again, if you take the second half of American history, then you will absolutely see how this changes and unfolds. But for now, we're thinking about the Republican Party emerging, and it's going to, in a way, emerge because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They're against the idea of slavery expanding any further. But let's think about this map and what this means. So again, you have your free states that are this green color. You have your slave states that are this gray color. And again, there's your Missouri Compromise right there. So voters get to decide on slavery because of the Compromise of 1850 right here. We've already talked about that. But now you have this Nebraska territory up here as well as the Kansas territory. And the question is, what should be done with that? So the Kansas-Nebraska Act basically is going to allow these territories to, again, use popular sovereignty and to vote on slavery, to decide for themselves if they want these areas to be enslaved or not to be enslaved. So from the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you also get what becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. And the idea of Bleeding Kansas is really popularized by newspapers. So different publishers like Horace Greeley, they really sort of sensationalize what's happening in Kansas, and they give it the name Bleeding Kansas. Now, while the Kansas-Nebraska Act says these areas are open to popular sovereignty and they can decide for themselves whether or not they will be free or enslaved, there's a lot of issues with that. And one of the issues that you're going to start to see is the question of when. So when are they going to be able to decide this? So with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, basically what you're going to have happen is that in Lecompton, you are going to have a pro-slavery government that's going to be set up. Now, if you think about where Kansas is, of course, there's Missouri, but there's also a lot of people who are coming in who are against the spread of slavery into Kansas, and they don't see it as necessary. So over here in Topeka, you are going to have an anti-slavery government that's going to form. But you can't have two state governments as Kansas applies for statehood. And the reason this becomes known as Bleeding Kansas is in part because of the violence that's going to ensue over whether or not slavery should expand. So you have a man named John Brown, who's also important later in this class, who ends up going with his sons, and as they go into Kansas, they end up killing 5 pro-slavery men. And you see even more violence sort of erupt over this. So the map I have up here for you shows some of the biggest instances of violence that are going to occur. There are some historians and some people who say that this is sort of the beginning of the Civil War in a way, that people are already fighting over slavery and its expansion and fighting over whether slavery should be left in place in the United States. And I mean, you have many people who were killed in these battles. In addition to that, you can also see things heating up with the caning of Charles Sumner. So now Charles Sumner is going to be so Senator Charles Sumner is actually going to be caned by Congressman Preston Brooks on the House floor. Like, he's actually going to be caned, and very, very bad situation. I mean, Sumner is actually going to be taken out of his position for a while because of this, because he has to have so much medical attention. And again, you can see the issues that are emerging over slavery. So you're thinking about Sumner being a senator from Massachusetts. Preston Brooks is a South Carolina representative. So thinking about this internal divide, and apparently this erupted over the issue of slavery and its expansion. And you can see people sort of falling into line with this. You have a lot of support in the North from abolitionists that go out to Charles Sumner. Like, a lot of people send him well wishes, cards. He's going to end up getting his position back. He's going to be voted for again. So they are really supporting, at this point, people who are against slavery and abolition. Then you also see on the other side, however, in South Carolina, the first state that's going to secede, Preston Brooks, after he canes this man almost to death, is going to get a lot of canes sent to him from a lot of these big plantation owners. One of the canes very famously says, "Hit him again." So seeing this violence that's erupting even in a political space. I mean, think about today, if you see a senator getting beat with a cane by a congressman. A lot of very, very high tensions that are emerging over the issue of slavery. So basically, what that's going to mean is that there are going to be dozens to hundreds of people who are going to be killed in the Kansas Territory, sort of on the eve of the Civil War. But keep in mind, again, you can still see the issues that are emerging. This is another picture to sort of explain the idea of bleeding Kansas. But the next thing that's really important for us to understand is going to be the Dred Scott decision. So, what happens with the Dred Scott case is that it is going to go to the Supreme Court. Now, with the Dred Scott case, so with Dred Scott, he is going to basically move with his owner to the free states of Illinois and Wisconsin. And when he moves to these states, he sort of sees that he has his freedom. He's gone to a free state. Eventually, his owner is going to force him to move back to Missouri, and that's when he begins to sue for his freedom. So, with Dred Scott, he says that because he has lived a certain amount of time in a free state, that he should be free. Now, this case is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. So, with the Supreme Court case, Roger Taney is going to end up writing the decision, and he's kind of going around Congress to do this. So, if you think about the past, Congress has really dealt with these issues of slavery. And rather than sort of compromising and working through Congress, Taney, who really supports the South and the expansion of slavery, helps to write this decision, 7-2 decision. And the first thing that it says, so number one, is that African Americans are not citizens, and therefore they do not have the right to take a case to court. They don't have citizenship rights. And that's very important because Dred Scott, this decision is going to haunt African Americans for many, many decades, even after the end of the Civil War, because again, it's essentially stripping them of citizenship rights that they should be guaranteed if they're free. So it's going to strip them of that. So the first thing it does is to get rid of their citizenship. The next thing he says is that essentially there's nothing constitutional about limiting slavery, and because you can't limit slavery, the Missouri Compromise, he says it's null and void, it's unconstitutional. So